Okay, so let's dive right in. So we're going to start with socialization and identity. So we'll start with personal versus social identity. So this lecture, I'm just going to go over, there are going to be a lot of bold-faced terms, so just make sure that you know all of them for the MCAT. There are a lot of just straight definitions in this, and those are really, really the most important, the important things that you understand for these sections. So an individual's self-identity is the sum of that individual's knowledge and understanding of themselves, I should say. So self-identity is how we see ourselves. It's not in the context, well, it's in a couple of different contexts. So self-identity is how we understand ourselves, how we use our experiences to create our perception of ourselves. So personal identity, self-identity is split up into a couple of different facets. So personal identity is made up of an individual's sense of personal traits like attributes. So if someone is smart, funny, someone's loud, maybe they're friendly. Personal identity is just basically the traits that make up who you are as an individual. So it's not something that we're going to talk about in a minute, like social identity, where it's in the context of others. We're just looking at ourselves. We're only looking at our characteristics, our behaviors, our tendencies, as opposed to social identity, which is made up of an individual's sense of their social self. So how we categorize ourselves into society, for example. So our race would be part of our social identity, our occupation, our age, gender, because these all tie us to different social groups, even different subcultures, for example. So if you're part of a motorcycle gang, that would be part of your social identity as well, because it's your identity in context of others in a social setting. So the looking glass self, American sociologist Charles Cooley, who is pictured over here to the left, came up with the concept of the looking glass self. So that is the idea that a person's identity develops from interpersonal interactions with and perception of others in society. So he basically said that from a very young age until we die, there's this concept called the looking glass self. So basically we set up our own identities based on our interactions with other people. So based on how we perceive others' actions and based on how we think others perceive our own actions. So like I just said, an individual will shape their self-identity based on the understanding of how others perceive them. So it's almost like we're monitoring our own reputation. So we're looking at how others perceive us, and then we fix our behavior based on how we perceive we are being perceived. So this looking glass self starts at a very early age. So pretty much as soon as you're old enough to understand, as soon as you have a social identity, this looking glass self conceptualizes and we start working on it. And it never ceases until death. So we continue to modify our identity based on our interactions with others throughout our entire lives. Because your interactions when you're in your early 20s are going to be very different than your interactions, say, when you're in your mid or late 50s. And people change throughout their lives. Okay, socialization's effect on identity formation. So the process by which people learn to be proficient and functional members of society is known as socialization. And that's not just people, it's all animals. Any social animal, from birth, they undergo socialization. And it allows for cultural transmission to the next generation. So it's basically taking like a blank slate, say a baby, if we're talking about humans, we're just putting them in a social context, and socialization is the process by which they learn all those cultural elements of their society. They learn how to, act and contribute to society. And that's what socialization is. And like I said, it happens for all social animals. So deprivation studies have shown the importance of early socialization in both humans and non-human animals. And one of the more infamous studies I'm sure you've heard of at this point, if you've ever taken a psychology class, is Harlow's monkeys, which is a pretty unethical study in which it demonstrated the inability of grown monkeys to reintegrate socially, after being extremely socially deprived as babies. So Harlow basically just took these baby monkeys and took away all of the resources and the things that baby monkeys really need to grow up socially, apt. So a lot of these monkeys, they were touch deprived, they were socially deprived when they were babies, and they grew up and they were socially inept, and they were inept in a couple of other aspects of their life when they reached adulthood. And similarly, feral children is the term used to describe children who are not raised with human contact. There are many documented cases, most of which involve social or communicative deficits in adulthood. Feral children is really interesting to read about. I actually did a little bit of reading about it when I was creating this slide. There are many documented cases of children being raised by animals, being raised by primates, wolves, livestock. So it's really interesting just to see how that affects the development, and just to see, these reported cases, how those children did as adults. Some of them did not suffer any social deficits, and then of course some of them did. But there are a lot of confirmed cases, and it's really interesting. If that's something that interests you, I would definitely recommend you give it a read. Okay, so norms. Norms are spoken or unspoken rules that govern an individual's behavior in a society. So in Northeastern America, for example, you probably should not go to the beach nude unless it's specifically designated for that purpose. If you think about, you go to certain cultures in Europe where it's a little bit more acceptable to go nude to a beach. Northeastern America, we're a little bit more uptight about stuff like that. There are laws and regulations in place to prevent stuff like this happening. So that's basically what norms are. They're just rules that govern the behavior in a society. So if you break a norm, there are varying levels of punishments that you may or may not receive, either formal or informal, which we'll talk about in a minute. But it's just basically when you break a norm, someone looks at you weird. So norms are just these rules that we follow that keep us in line with the rest of our society. Things that seem normal to us, hence the name. So norms are reinforced by sanctions, and sanctions are rewards or punishment for certain behaviors. And again, depending on how important the norm is to social cohesion, affects how strong the sanction is. So a norm that is more important for social cohesion are going to have stronger sanctions. So for example, if you kill someone, that's violating a norm. That's actually violating a formal norm, as we're going to talk about. Formal norms are norms that are written or recorded, such as laws, and those usually carry really strict penalties, because we just can't have a society of people going around killing each other without any consequences. So if you're in a society and you commit murder, those sanctions are going to be very steep. You're going to do prison time for a majority of your life. Whereas if we have these informal norms, which are those that are generally understood by individuals, but breaking them may not incur a severe punishment. So like I said, if you greet a stranger in the US with a hug rather than a handshake, you could create an awkward situation, but you probably won't be arrested. So in most places in the United States, the norm when you're meeting someone or when you're becoming acquainted with someone is to greet them with a handshake, for example. So if you overextend that, depending on the person that you're talking to, they might give you a weird look, or they might make a comment, and it might make you feel a little bit weird. So that's also considered a sanction. It's not prison time, but it's considered a sanction because it's a punishment for a strange behavior. You're breaking that informal norm, so the sanction is going to punish you for that. Okay, so take a minute, review this question, read it. I would pause the video. I'll wait about 5 seconds, and then I'm going to go over the answer. So let's go over it. A man in the waiting room of a private doctor's office erupts into a tantrum after he's told his appointment will be delayed 10 minutes. He becomes so angry that he throws his cell phone across the waiting room and refuses to leave. Other patients in the waiting room stare at him with disapproving to outraged expressions, and the office manager calls the police to have the man removed. Later that day, the man is informed that he has been discharged from that practice. Which of the following would not be considered a sanction imposed on the disgruntled patient? So the answer to that is D, the man's urge to throw his cell phone. So if we go through each individual answer, disapproving looks from bystanders is considered a sanction. Remember, it's not a super severe form of sanction, but it is a punishment. It's a social punishment, the disapproving looks. B, the manager calling the police is also a sanction. That's a little bit more strict of a sanction, probably because the disgruntled patient threw his cell phone. He was being, irate and to the point where he's being dangerous to others. So the manager called the police, he'll be removed, and he may possibly even be arrested. So that would also be considered a sanction. And that's for breaking a formal norm. He's sort of breaking the law by acting aggressively like that in the public forum. C, the discharge of this patient from the practice, that would also be considered a sanction because that is a direct result of his behavior in the office. So he broke that norm, and the sanction, the punishment is that he's being discharged from the practice. So the only one that's not considered a sanction is going to be D, the man's urge to throw his cell phone. That's not a sanction, that's actually the actual action that was performed that would warrant those sanctions. So definitely make sure you know the difference between those two. If you have any questions, like I said, shoot me an email.